In the autumn of 1959, in the receiving yard of the Bandon Creek Cranberry Cooperative, a silence fell over 200 people. It was a silence brought on not by tragedy, but by a number. A man named Peterson, the weighmaster for 32 years, cleared his throat and read from his clipboard one more time, as if to ensure the ink had not lied to him. The number he spoke settled over the assembled farmers and their families, men who had spent their lives measuring hope in barrels per acre. 1 year prior, in the spring of 1958, a 58-year-old farmer named Silas Blackwood had walked into the Farmers and Merchants Bank and borrowed $1,800 to buy 90 acres of land that everyone in the county agreed was wrecked. One harvest later, he would pay off the entire mortgage, with enough left over to buy a new truck, fund his son's future, and change the way an entire community thought about the ground beneath their feet. This is the story of how he did it. Let me tell you about the land, because the story begins there. The 90 acres lay 3 miles north of town, a low, sullen patch of earth bordered by Whisper Creek on the west and the county road on the east. For 100 years, it had been a functioning peat bog, a shallow wetland that breathed with the seasons. But in 1952, a man from Illinois named Henderson had bought it. Henderson was not a bog man. He was a corn man. He saw the rich, black soil and imagined rows of tasseling corn reaching for the Wisconsin sky. He saw the water as an enemy. He spent $15,000, a fortune at the time, to do what no one in Bandon Creek had ever thought to do. He tried to kill the bog. He brought in a steam shovel that cut deep drainage channels, and he laid thousands of feet of 6-inch clay tile, creating a subterranean network designed to bleed the land dry. For 2 years, he fought the water table. He limed the soil heavily, trying to raise the pH from its natural, acidic 45 to the 68 that corn preferred. He planted his corn in the spring of 1955. It grew 3 feet tall, yellow and stunted, and produced ears no bigger than a man's thumb. The bog fought back. The deep peat, deprived of its water, began to compact and subside. The drainage tiles, laid in the unstable soil, cracked and shifted. By 1957, Henderson was bankrupt. He abandoned the land, leaving behind a field of geological scar tissue. The land was considered wrecked, not just fallow, but fundamentally broken. The county agricultural agent, a well-meaning young man with a degree from the University of Wisconsin, wrote a formal assessment. He noted the irreversible soil compaction, the destroyed hydrology, and the chemical imbalance from the lime. The water that now pooled in the collapsed drainage ditches was stagnant and anaerobic. He concluded the land was suitable only for rough pasture and valued it at $20 an acre. For 2 years, it sat. Weeds grew. The ditches filled with cattails. It became a monument to a corn man's folly, a cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of not understanding the place you lived. It was a 90-acre wound on the landscape, and in that wound, Silas Blackwood saw a flicker of life. Silas Blackwood was 58 years old in the spring of 1958, and he had been working cranberry bogs for 50 of those years. He was a quiet man, known for standing at the edge of his fields for an hour at a time, just watching. He was not tall, but he was dense, built of the slow, powerful muscles that come from a life of physical labor. His hands were thick and calloused, but they could handle a delicate cranberry vine cutting with the precision of a surgeon. His family had been in Bandon Creek since 1871. His great-grandfather, Thomas Blackwood, had been the first to see the wild cranberries growing in the natural peatlands and understand their potential. He had established the first commercial bog in the county, a 5-acre plot that the family still worked. Silas had inherited more than the land. He had inherited a way of seeing it. His knowledge was not from a book. It was a physical thing, stored in his bones, passed down through 3 generations of observation. Let me tell you about what he inherited, because it matters. He had a set of 6 cranberry rakes, their scoops carved from cypress wood, their handles worn to a deep, dark patina by the grip of his father and his grandfather before him. Modern growers used aluminum rakes, but Silas believed the old wood was gentler on the vines. More important, he had a canvas sack. It was a simple, heavy-duty bag, stitched by his grandmother, and inside it were the cuttings of the Blackwood Crimson. This was the family's heirloom cranberry variety. For 80 years, they had selected the best vines from each harvest, the ones that survived the frosts, the ones with the deepest red color, the ones with the most intense, tart flavor, and propagated them. The university was developing new hybrids like the Searles Jumbo and the McFarland, bred for size and yield. They were impressive, but Silas believed they lacked resilience. They were loud, he once told his son, while the Blackwood Crimson knew how to listen to the bog. His father had taught him the central principle of their family's work. The bog knows what it needs, he'd say. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. In April of 1958, Silas walked into the Bandon Creek Farmers and Merchants Bank. He sat across a wide oak desk from Arthur Vance. Vance was 34 years old, the bank's new loan officer, a recent graduate of the agricultural economics program at Madison. He was sharp, confident, and he believed in data. His desk was neat, with the county agent's report on the Henderson property laid squarely in the center. Vance was not a bad man. He was a man who trusted systems, who believed that progress was a straight line moving away from the past. He wore a crisp white shirt and a tie, and he smelled of ambition. He looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and professional concern. Silas, I've reviewed your application. He tapped the report. And I have to be honest with you. This is not an investment. It's a liability. The soil pH is 68. You need 45. The cost to acidify 90 acres with sulfur would be, he consulted a chart, upwards of $8,000. The peat is compacted. You need to deep till the entire property, another $5,000 in heavy equipment rental. The hydrology is a disaster. It would take an engineer to even map out how to restore the water flow. That's before you even buy vines or prepare for a harvest. Silas sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He just nodded slowly. Vance leaned forward, trying to be helpful. The market is another thing. The price per barrel has been flat for 3 years. Ocean Spray is consolidating, and they favor the big, modern growers. A 90-acre bog starting from scratch, you'd be underwater for a decade, assuming you could even get a crop. The numbers just aren't there. Silas's son, Elias, was there. He was 22, fresh out of his own agricultural program at the local technical college. He was of Vance's world. He believed in soil tests and market projections. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dad, he's right. The report says. Silas raised a hand, just slightly, and Elias fell silent. Silas looked at Arthur Vance. His gaze was not confrontational. It was calm, steady, and ancient. The land is tired, he said. Not broken. It needs to rest and be reminded of what it is. Vance sighed. Silas, I can't approve a loan based on poetry. I need numbers. What's your plan to mitigate these risks? What's your projected yield? What's your timeline for profitability? My plan is to fix the water first, then the sand, then the vines. He said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He did not offer a number. Vance shook his head. I am sorry. The bank cannot take on this level of risk. The loan is denied. There was a long silence. Elias looked at the floor, a deep flush of embarrassment on his face. Silas just nodded again. He stood up. Thank you for your time, Mr. Vance. He turned and walked out. Elias scrambled to follow him. On the sidewalk, under the spring sun, Elias exploded. Dad, why didn't you tell him? About the sand, the way Grandpa fixed the North Bog? Why didn't you explain it? Silas looked at his son. His eyes were not angry, just weary. He said, a man who only trusts numbers will never understand the soil. He doesn't need an explanation. He needs to see. Silas did not give up. He went home, and from a locked metal box in his bedroom, he took out a life insurance policy and the deed to their 5-acre home bog. The next day, he went to the bank in the next town over in Warrens. He didn't ask for a business loan. He took out a personal mortgage against everything he owned. He got the $1,800. The interest rate was a punitive 11%, a sign of the lender's skepticism. When he filed the deed for the 90 acres at the county courthouse, the clerk looked up at him and asked if he was sure. Everyone knew that land. Silas just signed the papers. He owned the wound. The work began on the 1st of May, 1958. It did not begin with bulldozers or soil chemists. It began with the sound of sledgehammer. Silas and Elias walked the 90 acres, following the faint depressions in the earth that marked Henderson's buried drainage tiles. Silas carried a 16-pound sledgehammer, its handle polished smooth from years of use. Elias carried a pointed steel rod. Every 10 feet, Elias would drive the rod into the ground. When he hit the hard, hollow sound of clay tile, he'd stop. Then Silas would step forward. He would dig down 2 feet with a spade until the top of the 6-inch tile was exposed. And then he would raise the hammer. The first swing was a declaration of intent. The crack of the hammer against the clay echoed across the silent bog. It was the sound of undoing. They spent the entire month of May engaged in this single task. Elias drove the rod. Silas swung the hammer. They found and smashed over 4,000 feet of tile. It was brutal, monotonous work. Elias's back ached. His hands blistered. He couldn't understand. "Dad, we could run a subsoiler. It would rip these all out in 3 days." Silas never stopped swinging. "The machine doesn't know where the tile is. It would rip the peat, too. The peat is fragile. It needs to be disturbed as little as possible. We break the tile, and we leave it. The water will do the rest." By the end of the month, Elias understood. His father wasn't just destroying the drainage system. He was performing a kind of acupuncture on the land, targeting the precise points of Henderson's folly and leaving the surrounding tissue untouched. He was closing the wounds one by one. The work was slow. It was inefficient. It was also precise, intimate, and deeply respectful. He was not commanding the land. He was assisting it in its own healing. With the drainage tiles broken, the next task was to restore the water. Let me tell you about the water in a cranberry bog. It is not merely irrigation. It is the bog's circulatory system, its immune system, and its nervous system. It carries nutrients, regulates temperature, and protects against pests and frost. Henderson had seen it as an enemy to be expelled. Silas saw it as a partner to be welcomed back. He didn't just knock down the main drainage dike and let Whisper Creek flood in. That, he explained to Elias, would be a shock to the system. The creek water was too fast, too full of silt, and its temperature was too variable. The water needed to be calmed before it could enter the bog. He spent June and July of 1958 rebuilding the old dikes his great-grandfather had first surveyed. He did not use concrete or modern transit levels. He used his eye, a skill honed over a lifetime of watching water move across land. He and Elias moved earth with shovels and a single-axle wheelbarrow. For the main gate, where water would enter from the creek, he used fieldstone gathered from the edge of the property. He showed Elias how to fit the stones together without mortar, allowing for a slow, patient seepage that would filter the water naturally. Before the main dike, he dug a series of 3 shallow, settling ponds, each one feeding the next through a narrow channel. The creek water would enter the first pond, and its speed would slow, allowing the heavy silt to drop. It would meander into the second pond, where its temperature would begin to acclimate to the ambient temperature of the bog. By the time it trickled through the final stone gate into the 90 acres, it would be slow, clear, and calm. Arthur Vance, the banker, drove by one day in his new Chevrolet. He saw Silas and Elias, covered in mud, wrestling a 200-pound stone into place. He slowed, shook his head with a look that was part pity and part vindication, and drove on. He saw 2 men engaged in a primitive, pointless struggle against a dead piece of land. He did not see a man carefully preparing a home for a long-absent friend. On August 1st, 1958, Silas opened the main gate from Whisper Creek. Water trickled into the first settling pond. For a week, it filled the ponds, slowly, quietly. And then, one morning, a thin sheet of clear water finally overtopped the stone sill and began to creep across the surface of the 90 acres. It was not a flood. It was a reunion. The parched peat drank it in. The land, for the first time in 6 years, could breathe again. Now came the sand. The soil pH was still wrong, far too alkaline from Henderson's lime. The university-approved method was to apply elemental sulfur, a fast-acting chemical that would aggressively lower the pH. It was expensive and, in Silas's view, brutal. It was another command shouted at the soil. Silas's method was older, slower, and rooted in a specific local geology. He told Elias they needed sand. Not just any sand from any commercial quarry. They needed sand from the Cutler Pit. Let me tell you about the Cutler Pit. It was a small, overgrown sand and gravel pit 2 miles down a dirt road, abandoned since the 1930s. Geologically, it was a glacial came, a deposit left by melting ice sheets 10,000 years ago. The sand there was different. It was 98% pure quartz, coarse-grained, and entirely free of calcium carbonate. For generations, the Blackwood family had believed this sand held a unique property. When layered over the acidic peat of a bog, it acted as a perfect growing medium for cranberry roots, and it created a slow, natural buffer, helping the bog maintain its ideal pH over decades, not just a single season. It was folklore, a piece of inherited wisdom that had never been written down in university textbook. Getting the sand was an epic undertaking. Silas owned one truck, a 1947 Ford F3 with a flatbed. It was a sturdy, reliable machine, but its maximum payload was 3 cubic yards of sand. Silas calculated they needed to lay a 4-inch layer of sand across all 90 acres. The math was staggering. It came to just over 4,800 cubic yards of sand. Elias did the calculation in his head and felt a wave of despair. Dad, that's over 1,600 truckloads. It will take us years. Silas just nodded. Then we'd better start. For the rest of the summer and into the fall of 1958, they hauled sand. Their days fell into a rhythm of grueling repetition. They would leave at dawn, drive the 2 miles to the Cutler Pit. There was no front-end loader. They shoveled the sand onto the truck by hand. 2 men, 2 shovels, filling the 3-yard bed. It took them an hour. Then the slow, rattling drive back to the bog, the old Ford's engine groaning under the weight. They would back the truck to the edge of the newly flooded section, and for another hour, they would shovel the sand off, casting it out into the shallow water where it would drift down to cover the peat. A single trip, delivering 3 cubic yards of sand, took them nearly 3 hours. They managed 3, sometimes 4, trips a day. It was a pilgrimage. Every shovelful was an act of faith. The dust from the quartz sand coated their clothes, their skin, the inside of the truck cab. It was in their food and their hair. Elias's initial despair slowly transformed into a kind of meditative focus. He stopped counting the loads. He focused only on the next shovelful. He began to understand what his father was doing. He wasn't just adding a layer of sand. He was blanketing the damaged land in a substance he trusted, a material that was part of the same ancient story as the peat itself. He was tucking in. They did not manage to cover all 90 acres that year. They focused on the 40 acres on the north side, the section Silas felt was most ready. By the first frost, they had moved nearly 2,500 cubic yards of sand. They had made 833 trips in the old Ford truck. In late October, with the days growing short and cold, it was time to plant. Silas went to the small shed behind his house and returned with the old canvas sack. Inside, packed in damp moss, were the dormant cuttings of the Blackwood crimson vines. For 20 years, Silas had been carefully cultivating and expanding this genetic inheritance in a small, protected corner of his home bog. He had more than enough to plant the 40 acres. Elias had studied modern planting techniques in his classes. You use a machine that cut precise furrows, and you planted the cuttings in neat, geometric rows for ease of harvest. It was efficient. Silas emptied the cuttings into a wooden tub of water. He waded out into the newly sanded bog, the water chilling him to the bone. He told Elias to bring him the cuttings. He did not have a planting machine. He had his hands. He took a cutting, a 6-inch piece of dormant vine, and he pushed it into the sand deep enough to touch the peat below. He did not plant in straight lines. He followed the subtle contours of the bog floor, the almost invisible rises and swales that only someone who had watched the land for a lifetime could see. He planted in gentle, sweeping arcs that mimicked the flow of the water. Elias was baffled. "Dad, this is going to be impossible to harvest." The machines won't be able to follow these rows. The vines don't care about the machine, Silas said, not looking up. They care about the peat and the water. You plant them where they want to grow, not where we want them to be. A straight line is a sign of arrogance in a bog. For 2 weeks, they planted. On their knees in the cold water, they pushed thousands of cuttings into the sand. By the time they finished, the 40-acre plot looked like it had been sown by the wind. It looked natural. It looked alive. As the first snows of winter began to fall, Silas raised the water level one last time, flooding the bog completely. The water would freeze into a solid sheet of ice, protecting the new cuttings from the harsh Wisconsin winter. The bog was asleep. All they could do now was wait. The spring and summer of 1959 were a time of quiet tension. The vines took root. By July, a carpet of fine green runners was spreading across the sand. Silas spent his days walking the dikes, watching, checking the water levels, pulling invasive weeds by hand. The community watched, too. The story of Silas's folly was a common topic of conversation at the town diner. Most were sympathetic, but certain of his failure. Arthur Vance would occasionally drive by, his belief that he had been right to deny the loan reinforced by the sight of the seemingly haphazard, unprofessional-looking bog. He saw a field of weeds, not a nascent ecosystem. The real test came on the night of September 28, 1959. A weather front moved down from Canada, bringing unseasonably cold, clear air. The forecast on the radio was dire, a hard frost, with temperatures expected to drop to 28 degrees. For cranberry growers, a frost just before harvest is the ultimate nightmare. It can wipe out an entire year's crop in a few hours. The radio announcer urged all growers to turn on their sprinkler systems. Sprinklers were the modern solution, a recent innovation. Pumping water through sprinkler heads would coat the berries in a fine mist. As the water froze, it released latent heat, 334 joules per gram, to be exact, keeping the surface of the berry itself at a steady 32 degrees, protecting it from damage. But sprinklers were expensive. They required powerful pumps, miles of aluminum pipe, and a vast supply of water. Silas had none of that. His entire investment was in the land itself, not in the equipment on top of it. Elias was frantic. "Dad, we have to do something. All our neighbors are turning on their sprinklers. Our crop will be ruined." Silas was calm. He was watching the sky, feeling the subtle shift in the air. His grandfather had faced this 100 times. He said, "We have the water. We don't need sprinklers. Go to the main gate. Open it a quarter of the way." Elias was horrified. "Flood it? Now. That will ruin the berries. They'll be waterlogged." "Not a flood," Silas corrected him gently. "A blanket, just enough to raise the water level by 6 inches. Bring it just to the bottom of the berries, but not over them. Go now." Elias ran to the stone gate, his heart pounding with doubt. He did as he was told. Slowly, the clear, calm water from the settling ponds began to seep into the bog. Over the next 2 hours, the water level rose inch by inch. It was a delicate, nerve-wracking process. By 11 p.m., the water had risen to the level Silas had predicted. It lapped at the base of the thickest parts of the vine mat, a shimmering black mirror under the cold, starry sky. The green leaves and the now scarlet berries floated just above the surface. The water, which had been sitting in the deep peat all summer, was a relatively warm 45 degrees. The air temperature was dropping fast. Silas and Elias stood on the dike and watched the thermometer. At midnight, it read 32. At 2 a.m., 29. At 4 a.m., it hit 28 degrees. A delicate lacework of ice began to form on the surface of the water around the vines. The water was sacrificing its heat to the cold air, creating a thermal blanket just inches thick over the entire 40 acres. On the neighboring farms, the hiss of sprinkler systems filled the night air, a sound of expensive, frantic defense. On Silas's bog, there was only silence. It was in that long, cold silence that Elias's faith in soil reports and economic projections finally broke. He was witnessing a different kind of knowledge, a deeper conversation between a man and a piece of land. At dawn, the sun rose on a landscape of devastation. The radio reported that growers across the county were seeing 15% to 20% frost damage. The sprinklers, while helpful, had been overwhelmed by the sudden drop in temperature. Silas and Elias walked out onto their dike. The surface of their bog was covered in a thin, beautiful sheet of ice, with the green leaves and red berries perfectly preserved within it, like specimens in glass. As the sun warmed the air, the ice melted. The berries were firm, undamaged, and gleaming. They had lost nothing. The harvest took place 2 weeks later, on October 15th. The day was bright and cool. It seemed the entire town of Bandon Creek had turned out to watch. They lined the county road, their cars parked for half a mile in either direction. Arthur Vance was there, standing near the back, his arms crossed, a look of profound confusion on his face. This was the moment of truth. A bad harvest would be a quiet, private failure. A good harvest would be a public spectacle. Silas's harvesting method was as old as his rakes. He flooded the 40 acres completely, raising the water level a foot and a half. The ripe cranberries, with their 4 tiny air pockets, detached from the vines and floated to the surface, creating a solid, shimmering carpet of crimson. He and Elias, along with a few hired hands, waded into the bog, pushing large wooden booms ahead of them. They corralled the floating sea of berries toward a corner of the bog where a gasoline-powered conveyor lifted them out of the water and into the back of the old Ford truck. They worked all day. The truck made trip after trip to the Bandon Creek Cranberry Cooperative, each time filled to the brim. The sheer volume of berries was the first sign. The pile of Blackwood crimson cranberries in the co-op's receiving bay grew to a shocking size. By 4 p.m., the last berry was harvested. The crowd moved from the bog to the co-op yard for the official weigh-in. This was the ceremony that ended every harvest season. Peterson, the weighmaster, a man whose pronouncements could make or break a family's year, stood on a raised platform. He held the final tally sheet for the Blackwood bog. He adjusted his glasses. He checked the figures. He looked out at the silent crowd, at Silas standing quietly by his truck, and then he spoke. Silas Blackwood, 40 acres harvested. Total yield, 6,000 barrels. A murmur went through the crowd. Men did the math in their heads. 6,000 barrels from 40 acres. That was 150 barrels to the acre. The county average that year, with the frost damage, was hovering around 95. Even in a good year, 120 was considered excellent. 150 was unheard of. It was a number that bordered on the miraculous. Peterson wasn't finished. He held up a hand for silence. The co-op board has set this year's price, he announced. Given the frost losses elsewhere, demand is high. The price is $12 per barrel. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy. It was the sound of 200 people recalibrating their understanding of the world. 6,000 barrels at $12 each. Elias, standing next to his father, did the quick calculation. $72,000. From one harvest. From 40 acres of land, everyone said was dead. He looked at his father. Silas's expression had not changed. He just nodded once, a small acknowledgement to the weighmaster. He had not been trying to beat anyone. He had simply been listening to the land, and this was its response. Arthur Vance stood motionless, his face pale. The data had been correct. The systems had been logical, and they had been completely, utterly wrong. His entire worldview had been invalidated by a quiet man, an old truck, and a pile of red berries. The next morning, Silas Blackwood drove the Ford into town. He parked in front of the Farmers and Merchants Bank and went inside. He walked up to Arthur Vance's desk. He did not say a word. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small stack of bills. He counted out 18 $100 bills and laid them on the polished oak. Then he placed a loan coupon on top of them. Paid in full. Vance looked at the money, then up at Silas. His confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, bewildered respect. He started to say something, I don't understand how. Silas just looked at him. You can't measure the spirit of a place, Mr. Vance. He turned and walked out of the bank, the weight of the $1,800 loan lifted from his shoulders forever. The aftermath unfolded over decades, as all true stories do. The Blackwood Bog became the most consistent and resilient producer in the county. In the drought of 1963, when other bogs struggled for water, Silas's settling ponds and deep peat held their moisture. In the price collapse of 1971, when cranberries dropped to $7 a barrel, his low overhead allowed him to turn a profit while others went into debt. He never planted the other 50 acres. He said the first 40 were enough, and the rest of the land deserved to heal at its own pace. Elias took over the bog in 1978. He never went back for a university degree. He had received his education on his knees in the cold water, his hands in the quartz sand. He ran the bog using his father's methods, resisting the push for chemical fertilizers and automated harvesting systems. He taught his own children how to listen for the sound of a drainage tile and how to read the language of the water. The Blackwood Crimson became a local legend, sought after by specialty jam makers and restaurants for its superior flavor. Arthur Vance left the bank 2 years after Silas's first harvest. He took a job as the county agricultural agent, the very position held by the man who had first condemned the land. He spent the next 30 years advising farmers. And whenever a young, ambitious grower came to him with a new idea that defied conventional wisdom, Vance would lean back in a chair and tell them a story of a 90-acre patch of wrecked land, a stubborn old farmer, and a harvest that nobody believed was possible. What survives is not always what is strongest, but what is most deeply connected to its place. A system built on shallow data can be powerful, but it is brittle. It cannot account for the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 seasons. True value is often hidden beneath a surface of neglect, and its potential is visible only to those who have the patience to look and the humility to listen. It was not the land that was wrecked. It was only the way of seeing it. Silas Blackwood did not perform a miracle. He simply paid attention, and in doing so, he reminded a whole town that the most profound strength often comes from the quietest places.